I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which this podcast is recorded today, the Wiradjuri people, my people. I'd like to take this time to acknowledge our elders, past, those that watch over, guide and protect us, present, those that walk beside us, nurture and teach us the way, and future, the young ones that will succeed us into the future. I would like to acknowledge our continued connection to the lands, the waterways, and the skies, our animals, plants, and fauna. I would like to acknowledge our history. In story, song, and dance, we continue to share these stories. I would like to acknowledge each and every one of you. And I'd like to acknowledge the lands on which you tune into today, where you sit, where you live, where you work, and where you play, and how important it is for us to acknowledge where we are at this very moment. Mandangu, thank you.
Hi, I'm Jenny, host of It's Not About the Money, and today I'm speaking with Dr. Bronwyn Bruce. For many years, Bronwyn was known as Miss Moneybox, a financial educator and advocate, and she now works as an academic at RMIT University, where she teaches and conducts research in the School of Economics, Finance and Marketing. Bronwyn completed her PhD on the topic Becoming Superwomen, exploring the financial wellbeing of Australian millennial women through superannuation, and she joins me today to talk about superannuation, the relationship between retirement savings and financial wellbeing, why superannuation as it's currently designed doesn't always work as well for women, and why it is important for women of all ages to engage with their superannuation to feel more in control and to build financial security. Welcome, Bronwyn, and thanks so much for joining us on It's Not About the Money podcast. I am so excited to talk to you today because it's not often I get to talk about one of my favourite topics, which is superannuation, without people's eyes glazing over. So could you start by sharing with us the lands that you live and work on?
Sure. And hi, Jenny, by the way. Nice to talk to you. So I live on Wurundjeri land, so I'm in Melbourne, and I work at RMIT University. I teach in the marketing discipline in the School of Business and Law, and I'm also doing a bunch of research actually on different topics. I've just finished a research project looking at gender in the transportation sector, and I've just started a new one looking at financial capability.
You have completed a PhD, and we're going to talk about that as well, but is this where you expected to be when you were younger?
Oh, no. The concept of a PhD was something I never thought I would ever do. To be honest, I just sort of fell into it. I thought I would be a journalist, and I did do journalism for a couple of years, but it didn't suit me very well. I'm not forthright enough, maybe. I found it very difficult to ask the hard questions.
Yes.
So I left that, ended up in communications and marketing, and then I really wanted to do a postgraduate degree looking at finance. And so I started a master's by research, and that eventually rolled into a PhD because my supervisors just said to me one day, "Oh, you've done half of the PhD. You might as well just upgrade and complete a PhD." So, they're very convincing people, quite obviously. So, yeah, I did. I ended up spending 5 years of my life working on my PhD.
So what was it that sparked your interest in finance?
I think because when I was younger, I knew that I maybe knew more than other people just because of the way my parents were with money. My dad's very into investing. He was all about the stock market when I was a kid. And then my mother is a great budgeter and would show us how she would budget from month to month. And I thought maybe I've been given something that other people haven't. And as I got older, I realized that that was probably the case. Just the knowledge that some people had wasn't maybe what I was lucky enough to get. And so it was in my 20s that I started thinking I should really, do something about this, help share what I know. And I did start investing in the stock market at that time, and it was just unbelievably difficult. There was just no information that I found was very accessible. It felt like reading a phone book, to be honest. And I made some massive blunders. I lost some money.
Yeah. Nothing like lived experience, though, to be that great teacher, right?
Oh, absolutely. So, I made some mistakes. I lucked out and, did well in some investing. But all these things I had learned from growing up and in my own experiences, I thought, I feel like I can share this. So that's when I started my blog, which was Miss Moneybox. And then she has now retired. But I ran that for about 5 years, and it was just content that I thought, this is something I know about that I feel like other people might want to learn about if they're so inclined. So I would just write content and people read it.
Yes. It's interesting because, of course, now we're in an era of social media where we can very easily access blogs and websites and podcasts about finance. There's so many more books that are out there, especially those written by women and Australian women, which is fantastic. But what you were doing with Miss Moneybox was actually quite cutting edge at the time, because there weren't a lot of women, especially out there in that space, and writing in such an accessible way, were there?
No, I didn't know any. So that's why I thought maybe I need to be that person. So that's why I did it. And I think writing in an accessible way is something I've been fortunate enough to be able to learn through working in comms and stuff. So I think it's one of my best skills, actually, taking quite technical, jargony information and translating it to very easy to understand information. So I just thought, I have this knowledge and I know I can do this. And I just felt like people could learn from what I knew. Yeah.
And of course, in terms of that, taking your knowledge and your writing and all of that in the context of your PhD, which is looking at exploring the financial wellbeing of Australian millennial women through superannuation. And I have read it and it is awesome. So many amazing things in it, and we're going to touch on some of those. But to start with, let's talk about super. Okay. I love super.
Me too.
I think it is wonderful. I did not think it when I was very early 20s, starting my first paid job, and superannuation had just come in. This is 1992. And I was quite horrified that the government was taking my money and putting it away and I couldn't touch it. I've since come to love it. But if somebody was at a barbecue, you happen to mention I've just done my PhD on superannuation, somebody says to you, what is superannuation? How would you explain it? I
would explain it as future-proofing your life.
Ooh.
So making small sacrifices today so that in the future you can live the life that you want.
I love that. That is so much better than a tax-effective way to save for retirement. It is far more relatable. And I love that idea of future-proofing, and that will certainly come back when we start talking about the role of super in financial wellbeing. From your experience of writing as Miss Moneybox, from working in academia and other things, what are your observations on how most people, and especially most women, feel about super?
Okay, so the younger women, it's very much non-existent in what they're thinking. So I teach undergraduate students at RMIT, so they're aged probably about 18 through to 23, and I'll tell you, I start every class by saying, I've just recently completed my PhD in financial wellbeing. I was exploring superannuation. I said it's one of my favourite topics. If anyone would like to talk about superannuation with me at any point, please come talk to me. One student has ever asked me about it. So, which was amazing, by the way. She was very interested. But there's just this role of hyperbolic discounting, right? So money that has this value today is seen as, it's worth more, right, than money that you put away for the future. And you can totally understand that. If you're 20 and you're thinking, next year I'm going to get a car, or I'm going to travel to Europe, or, you're not thinking, in 45 years I'll be 65 and I'm going to need however many hundreds of thousands of dollars. Yeah. It's not there. It's not something to think about. So there's just this massive disconnect. And I don't, even after doing a PhD, there is not really an answer to how we get people interested in super. There are things that can happen in people's lives, and it's sort of a life cycle approach. And it's, things that happen, you get a bit older, maybe you earn a bit more money, you have children, or you have something bad happen like a divorce. And then you think, oh my gosh, I really need to think a bit more about the future.
Yes.
But really, until that happens, there's no engagement.
And it's such a shame, isn't it? Because we know when you're investing that the longer the money is sitting in there, earning interest and growing, the more that there's going to be, which means starting thinking about super when you're in your 20s makes such a difference compared to if all of a sudden you're hitting your 50s and 60s and go, I really need to start thinking about super now, because you've missed 40 years of compounding returns and growth in your money. And little changes that you can make in your 20s make a massive difference by the time you hit your 60s and can take your super out.
Absolutely. I explored 5 different behaviours that people can take now. So my group was millennial women. So when I started, millennials were younger. Now we're here. It took a long time to write a PhD. But so sort of at that point it was 25 to 40. Now we're looking sort of more 28 to 43.
Yep.
That was the way that I cut the generation. So I was looking at check. So check that you are being paid super. Combine, make sure you have just one account so that you're only paying one set of fees. This is less of an issue now because we've got stapling that's come in. Contribute if you can. Don't put extra money into super if you actually can't afford it. But if you can, do it. Invest. I reckon this one's the best one, especially if you're young. You can change your investment options. It's so easy.
Yes. It makes such a big difference.
And it makes a huge difference, and it doesn't cost you anything.
Let's talk about financial wellbeing versus financial literacy and financial capability, because we often hear discussions around we need to put financial literacy in schools, which often ignores the fact it is in the Australian curriculum already. But well-being is about a lot more than just the knowing, isn't it?
It's a little bit on a spectrum. So financial literacy, I would break it down as just knowing. So, you might know what 2 + 2 is, and that's 4. That's literacy in that sense. If you know something but don't actually know how to then act on it, then what good is it? So I have a bit of a gripe because for a long time, financial literacy has been measured asking these questions about knowledge. And it started with these 2 academics in the United States, and it's called the Big 3 financial literacy test. And they ask questions, like if you I can't even remember what the questions are. If you had $100 in a bank savings account and the interest per year was 2%, how much would you have in a year? You might be able to figure that out, right? But is that something that you would act on, knowing that? So for a long time, we have measured literacy in this way. It did start to change around 2007, and in Australia a little bit later, towards capability. And that's the actual behaviours and the actions people take. One company that's actually done a pretty good job of doing this is ANZ. So they have And they have for a long time, since the 2003 or 2002, I think they started. They were measuring first financial literacy, then they switched it to financial capability, and now they measure well-being. So it's this progression of actually what actually do we need to measure, rather than looking at just the very basics like we used to do back in the 2000s. So capability is behaviours, actions that people take. And then well-being is looking at sort of finance in a more holistic sense. You know, do you have enough money for today, or do you have the knowledge and the behaviours that you can have enough money for today, as well as the future, so that you will be financially fit today, tomorrow, and into the future.
So financial well-being is then about our ability to meet our obligations today. We've got a little bit put aside and we've got some planning into the future. We're feeling in control of those money decisions that we're making. How does superannuation fit in to that broader context of financial well-being?
So if you have the foresight to take these actions within super when you're younger, you're going to accumulate enough money so that when you need it, when you retire, your future is looked after. You know, you hear these, and this is one of the stats that really hinges my PhD, which everyone uses now, about women over 55 becoming the fastest growing homeless population in Australia. And these are women on the edge of being able to access their super, but chances are they don't have that much super. So it's the safety net, right? Super to me is a safety net. A lot of women, unfortunately, maybe not so much millennials, maybe older women, the ones that are in my mum's sort of age group, put financial control with their partner, or maybe they got divorced later in life and decided, well, I'll have the house and he'll take the super. And then they're stuck with this massive asset that they don't want to sell because that's their house, but then they don't have any money. So how good is that for your financial well-being if you actually don't have any money when you're older?
Yes. And for many of those older women, as you said, if they don't actually have a home ownership in retirement is one of the key indicators whether you'll be living in poverty or not. If you don't own a home, you're far more likely to experience poverty in retirement, which I think is really reflective of the high interest rates, the lack of social housing, the lack of affordable, accessible housing available, and especially for, as you said, women who haven't had often the opportunity to build up that safety net in superannuation or outside of superannuation. Given that women live longer in retirement, superannuation is even more important for women. But there is a massive superannuation gap, isn't there?
Oh, yeah.
We talk a lot about the gender pay gap, but the gender super gap is very real.
Yeah. And there's a lot of reasons for the super gap. It does hinge from the gender pay gap. So if you earn less money, you're obviously going to be putting less money into super through your superannuation guarantee contributions. But then on top of that, a lot of women obviously have children. They take time out of the workforce. They're not getting super when they're on maternity leave. For a long time, I think it was last year it changed. If you earned under $450 a month, no super. So, and a lot of women and have casual jobs where they earn a little bit of money here and a little bit of money there. So they were getting no super. So there are a whole bunch of reasons why there's the super gap. My stats put the gap at about 30% for the superannuation gap. And you'll see it. I mean, go on any superannuation fund website and you can actually compare the difference of genders and how much super people get. But on top of women taking time out of the workforce, then if they come back to work, they often work part-time. They've sort of maybe missed that career ladder step that they could have got on if they didn't have kids. So they don't make the big money that perhaps men might make. And then, if they're putting 11% or whatever the actual percentage is when it gets to 12, away from for their super, it's not as much as what men are putting away.
Mm.
So it's just inherent that it's going to be much less than what men are putting away into their super. So
I think one of the scary statistics, I mean, we can talk about older women who don't have a superannuation account, and I think on average it's around 1 in 3. And there's a lot of discussion, it'll be different for younger women, but actually when you look at the modelling, it's not going to be that different for younger women. And that's a really scary statistic, that in fact we're not going to see that change because we're not addressing those underlying issues of the gender pay gap, the fact that women tend to work in industries that have lower rates of pay. Women are more likely to work part-time. As you said, you miss that. When you take time out of the workforce, you miss that progression. But also women are less likely to be promoted and progressed anyway. And all of this work against women. So even if you are 20 now, the reality is that when you hit retirement, there's probably still going to be a gender super gap.
Yeah. And it expands immensely in the decade of the 30s. So some of my sources say, like, in the 20s, it's pretty even. And then it's when women, if they decide to have kids, it's when they have kids that they are penalised, really.
Yes. I think it is appalling that while the government has abolished that $450 a month earnings threshold for super guarantee, parental leave, paid parental leave, is the only paid leave that does not require superannuation guarantee to be paid on top of it.
Yeah, I don't understand it at all. But couples, you can have a discussion with your income earning partner to ask them to contribute to your super while you're on leave. But then you have to know that you should do that. You have to, and then you have to arrange it, just to keep your balance topped up so that it keeps compounding while you're on leave. And that's one way.
One of the other things, and I do want to come back to some practical things that women can do to minimise the impact of the systemic disadvantages, but often when women take time out of the workforce, anyone, but especially women are statistically more likely to do it, and especially when they've got those caring responsibilities. If you're out of the workforce for too long, if you don't maintain an active superannuation account, if you're not contributing or you're not keeping in touch with your super fund, you can lose the insurance that you have attached to your super fund if you haven't. I'm talking there about life insurance, income protection, and total and permanent disability. It can actually be removed if your account becomes inactive.
Yep. And a lot of these insurances, until you need them, you're probably not even thinking about.
No.
But they could be a lifeline for you if for some reason you cannot work for an extended period of time, or you cannot work for forever for some reason because you have some health issue or whatever. And your super fund can actually help you in that. But if you're not staying on top of your super and being engaged in it, and all of a sudden, my insurance is not active, and you try to access it, it's one of these things, you have to stay engaged, but at the same time, people are just so not interested.
Yeah.
It's a real catch-22.
It absolutely is. The other thing about insurances is sometimes that definition of total and permanent disability, if you are a homemaker, and that's the term that's often used, or home duties, the definition of total and permanent disability is different to if you are working, and it can sometimes be harder to access. And there's all these embedded inequalities in the products that often make it harder for women to get the support that they need when they actually need it.
Yeah, you can't, you have to be very careful with insurance. And reading a product disclosure statement about insurance from a super fund is, it's the last thing even I want to do.
Can you tell us about the superannuation engagement archetypes of Australian millennial women that you developed as a result of your PhD? And do you think that they have a wider application beyond millennial women?
Good question. Well, I'll tell you about them, and I'll consider if I think they can have a wider application. So essentially, after I'd done my 32 interviews with millennial women, I categorized everyone into different segments based on 4 different characteristics. So I was looking at age, income, psychographics, and engagement with super. So engagement being those 5 behaviours. So check, combine, contribute, invest, and insure. Psychographics were, are they partnered or married? Do they have children, not children? Are they divorced? Life stage, desire to have a family, all these sorts of things. So with that, I came up with, it's on a spectrum from enthusiastic to aware to indifferent. And then within those, there's a couple of different types of segments. So in enthusiastic, you've got someone who's seriously sorted, and then there's someone who's probably a little bit less engaged, but they've got their ducks in a row. And then in the aware group, there's someone who's maybe curious about their super, or there's someone who's a risk taker. I had quite a few participants in my study who generally were not interested in super, thought the government was going to take their money at some point anyway, didn't trust them, but were like, well, I'll put it all in stocks. Basically, it's like going to the casino and chucking it all on black or whatever. They're like, let's just see what happens. So that was interesting. And then in the indifferent group, we've got tomorrow's problem, like just really, really uninterested. And then there's needs a nudge. So, potentially with the right sort of influences, there's things that could be done with that type of segment. So, so there's 6 segments, and of those I created personas to make them a little bit more representative and, easier to digest.
Just thinking about that, I'm just going to put it all in stocks. Ironically, they're probably ending up better in the long run than people who do nothing at all. Just leave it in the default balance product.
It's so interesting. And a lot of them, it's because, and, in my research, I looked at the idea of self-efficacy. So self-efficacy is a belief that you could do something if you try, right? And it is driven by either hearing about someone who's done it, or being encouraged to do it by someone that you trust, or doing it and going, oh, that wasn't so hard, I could do that again, or maybe take it to another level. So these risk takers, it was just a side conversation often with someone who they trusted, who they thought, this person knows what they're talking about, and they said, just put all your super in stocks. They just went and did it.
And on that note, one of the things that your research explored was where Australian millennial women obtain their information, and social media and podcasts have a big role to play. What are the pros and cons of that? Should we all be running out and listening to podcasts and making decisions based on their information? Or are there some things that possibly we need to keep in mind when we're accessing that information?
So there has been this explosion of podcasts, not just true crime, but personal finance podcasts. And for the most part, they're pretty good. What you can do if you're worried about the information that you are getting on podcasts is check, are they licensed, by a financial advice provider? Most of them are. So they are one place where you can get your information, but you shouldn't just, listen to a podcast and go, oh, I'm going to do that, And to be honest, women generally don't, except for my risk takers. They generally will listen to the information on the podcast, engage with the online community to find out more, then talk to friends and family. So it's this multi-pronged approach to self-educating. And from that, I think people can get a more holistic idea of maybe what they could be doing, because accessing financial advice is the barriers to that are immense. I mean, the cost is the number one thing. I remember once I went to go and access financial advice, and I'm pretty sure they laughed at me when I left because, well, no, they didn't, but I just didn't have enough money for them to be talking to me, quite honestly. You have to pay upwards of $3 just to get advice that's tailored towards you. So, podcasts are great, but it's just one piece of the puzzle in terms of educating yourself about finances.
It's interesting you touched on there that women will listen to podcasts, access information on social media, have the conversations, find out more. Because one of the myths that women often get told is that we are bad at making financial decisions, but actually we are really good, aren't we?
Really good, yeah. Really good when we know where to get it and when we're given good information. And for a long time, this information just wasn't available and it wasn't accessible. Think about the blog that I wrote, Miss Moneybox, and having, my personal view that it needs to be more accessible. And then, so many other people are doing the same thing now. If you think about She's on the Money, Victoria Devine, extremely accessible information, or the Australian Finance Podcast with Owen and Kate, the way that they talk about money, they're not doing it in a way to exclude you. They're doing it in a way to make it very easy for you to understand. And this type of information wasn't around for so long, but now it's here. Yeah.
There's some great resources out there. What role do you think the financial advice sector has in supporting women around superannuation and financial wellbeing, keeping in mind that it is often cost prohibitive?
It's a tricky one. I could probably talk more about the role that super advisors have in super funds. So there is no cost to that advice, and a lot of people don't know about that. So you pay fees to your super fund, not for no reason, you pay fees so that if you want to talk to one of their advisors, you can talk to one of their advisors. Yes, they're going to talk only about their super products. Having worked in a superannuation fund and knowing some of these advisors, they are extremely passionate and they actually really care about the outcomes that their clients have. And they spend a lot of time trying to understand their needs. And this is something you can do for free.
One of the issues with the industry is it's so male dominated. And I know this was reflected in some of the comments and quotes that you included from the participants in your PhD, but also for women being able to talk to another woman and another woman who shared a similar lived experience, come from a similar diverse background, for example. There are cultural things to consider. There are practical things to consider. And I think sometimes that gets missed in the broader advice landscape because it is so heavily dominated by a specific demographic.
It's I imagine, quite difficult to have a conversation with, I'm probably a quite well-off man about your financial situation and feel a sense of trust or shared values. And that's what women look for when they are seeking information about finance. So if you don't have that, then are you going to take on what they say? Because it just feels like there's a divide between the lived experience of the person who you're talking to and yourself. So there definitely does need to be more women in that sector. How do we get them?
Yes.
And then how do we get people to be able to get that advice without it costing the earth?
Yes. It's a big challenge, isn't it? Jess Brady explains it so beautifully that the financial advice industry is basically white affluent men, wealthy white affluent men, advising other wealthy white affluent men what to do with their money. And I think she gets it. She nails it because, like you said, you've got to be wealthy enough to get advice, and then you can maximise your wealth that you've got. So I've got some concluding questions.
Mm-hmm.
So the first one is 3 women who have inspired you and why.
So first is my mother. She is a very hardworking woman who had 2 jobs when I was a child. And money wasn't something that we didn't see or hear about. You know, every month, you know, she had a jar of money that she would use to pay the credit card bill or the checkbook or whatever. She would take us to the bank. We learned about, you know, saving, term deposits, all that sort of stuff. There were times when my dad was laid off and he couldn't work, and we got through it, and it was never something that felt like was my problem or my sister's problem, because they were prepared, they were savers. And my mum continued working. She's always worked. In fact, she's meant to be retired now, but she continues to go back to do 1 or 2 days now and again. So my mum.
I think it's really interesting, that story about your mother, though, because one thing I think often people don't realise is that children are going to absorb the money lessons from us, whether they're explicit or not. And even that action of taking you to the bank and modelling that behaviour would have made a big difference.
It's huge, and that's part of this whole self-efficacy piece that I looked at in my PhD. Modelling behaviour, seeing that vicariously or hear, and then mastery. You know, then when I open my bank account, because I've seen it already, that my mum has modelled to me. So it was never a very scary or strange thing to open a bank account, to save money, to do term deposits. My mother's a huge fan of term deposits, you know, and then I would do the term deposits because I've seen it and I've experienced it my whole life. And then I progressed further into the stuff that my dad had been doing as I got older. So I've been extremely lucky that I've got parents who are transparent, I guess, with the way that they handle money. Not all kids have that.
And it's such a simple thing that we can do as parents, as carers, as grandparents, or with any of the little people in our life when we go shopping, having those conversations with them, modelling and talking to them. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. It's just those little teachable moments.
Absolutely. I used to go to the supermarket with my mum once a fortnight, and I loved it. And it's the same. I do remember there were stickers on the prices of things, and I was very aware of that, you know, and because I got pocket money, I got $1 a week, you know, so I would be like, well, what can I afford, you know? And my parents never indulged me. It was never, oh, here's some more money. It was always, okay, can you afford it? Or if not, you're going to have to save up for however many more weeks to be able to afford it. So they were a bit tough in that way. But I think in the long run, it's been very beneficial for me.
It's really embedding those skills and knowledge, but also the values. Can you afford it is a priority. They're the conversations I have with my kids now, is you could spend your money on that, but if you spend the money on that, then you will have no more money. And is that worth, does that have value to you? Value versus price. If you were Prime Minister for a day, what would be your number one objective regarding gender equality and building women's financial security?
All right. So you know how we talked about there is financial literacy in schools, but we still have this problem, right? What I reckon is what is needed is teachers need to have a sense of self-efficacy that they can teach financial capability to their students. There are myriad resources available, you know, to teachers. Like there's the Tax Super, a new website. There's a whole bunch of resources. If they don't feel the confidence in themselves that they can actually teach that to their students, they're not going to use it. They're fantastic resources. So it starts with helping out the teachers who are going to teach the kids, building up their self-efficacy in that way. My dream would be we could teach teachers about financial capability when they're undergraduates at university. That's like long-term goals for me.
I love that so much.
Yeah. So, embed it into the education curriculum for teachers. Teachers are amazing, right? They have to know and do so much. If there's something that they don't feel like they can teach, or they don't have that self-belief, how are they going to inspire their cohort of students? They're not, right? And if they've come from, the backgrounds of so many people, where they maybe didn't get that financial education growing up, how can they do it? So
absolutely,
it's a big goal. The one thing I guess I've learned from my PhD is you have to come at this problem through multiple channels. So that's one thing that I feel like if I was Prime Minister, I'd be like, right, into the educational curriculum for, training teachers, we're going to build their self-efficacy towards financial capability so they can teach it to their students.
3 things that women can implement now to make a difference in their financial position, in addition to the 5 steps for superannuation.
I would say educate yourself. Don't fall into this trap of, especially women who are in relationships, particularly with men, of letting them have the control and saying, oh, he's sorting all that out. Because anything can happen. And one day he could be gone. And you'll be like, what do I do with all this stuff now? So it's very easy to say, be proactive, educate yourself, take control of your finances. It's a very different thing to do. So I don't have the answers for how exactly that happens.
Do you have any resources to share, though, your go-to resources that you would recommend to women who want to know more?
Oh, I think you can't go past ASIC's Money Smart website. I think it's the top resource. Everything is there. It's very easily explained. It's kept up to date. And, it's very short entries about things that you might want to know about. And then, I did do a PhD that looked at podcasts, so I can't say, I have to say some personal finance podcasts. My favorite is the Australian Finance Podcast, hosted by Kate and Owen, because they're very even-handed in the way that they approach topics. They give you the pros and cons, and there's not a lot of their own personal views in there. So I like the Australian Finance Podcast. Yeah.
And that is a good podcast, and I love Kate's book. I just want to say thank you so much, because that has been an awesome conversation. Thank you for touching on so much of your PhD and your insights.